Okay, chapter 9, verse 1. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither have this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So the blind man was blind from birth, and he didn't he didn't sin, he didn't deserve his blindness, is what Jesus was saying. I'm sure he did actually sin at some point. Only Jesus is perfect. But he didn't sin, he didn't deserve the blindness that he got. But it was an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power through this man's blindness. And a lot of people that suffer with infirmities, that have like a life sentence, for example, you might be a paraplegic or something else, those guys that come to faith in Christ, if they're not healed, they have opportunities to let God's power be manifested in him through through being light in the world. There's so much that people can do regardless of the situation that you're in. But in this case, this was definitely the case that Jesus was going to use this man to demonstrate the power of God. And what happened was Jesus healed him. And, people that knew him, the crowd, they said to him, how were their eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received my sight. So people were questioning, they recognised the guy. It's like, hang on a minute, you're supposed to be blind. What is it that you did? And apparently Jesus made some clay, put it in his eyes. He went and washed in a certain place, Siloam, and all of a sudden he could see. And he was well known, and what happened was they brought him to the Pharisees. Now, as we know, the Pharisees, they didn't like Jesus very much. He was kind of taking all of their glory, whereas Jesus was trying to glorify his Father. But they didn't like him. So they had this problem now. They had this guy who all of a sudden he was blind. He was well known as blind, and he could see. And Jesus was demonstrating his power in this guy. And the Pharisees had a choice. Would they believe the account of many, or would they just basically shrug it off? Well, they listened to all the people. They still didn't believe, and what happened was they decided to call his parents and get them in. And the parents, they sort of testified. And what happened was they had clear evidence from all of these witnesses, including the parents, that this guy was blind, but now he sees. And the parents said, we know that this is our son and that he was blind. But they couldn't understand why all of a sudden that he could see. And the Pharisees, they weren't happy with this Jesus guy, because he was healing on the Sabbath. And they actually said in verse 24 to this blind man, Give God the praise, we know that this man is a sinner. Now that's just crazy, because Jesus is God manifested in the flesh, and the Pharisees were here saying, Give God the praise, we know that God is a sinner. Can you see how that sounds? It's like, it's so hypocritical. They're saying you need to give God the praise, but God is a sinner. It doesn't make any sense. So in verse 25 he answered the blind man and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. So he was completely blind, and all of a sudden he could see. And he didn't know who Jesus was, didn't know that he was a sinner, but he could see the obvious thing, that of course he couldn't have been a sinner, he must have been from God. And he tries to explain that to them. He says, and the Pharisees kept on asking him, and he said, Well, why would you want to hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? Because they were absolutely curious about this Jesus guy. Why is it that Jesus could heal? And they kept on asking all of these questions. And of course they didn't like him, but they were so curious, they just kept on asking over and over again. And the blind man was getting so frustrated, he says, well, do you want to be his disciples also? Of course, that just made them blew their lid. They were well annoyed about that. And in verse 30, the blind man said to them, where herein is a marvellous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. And he says in verse 33, if this man were not of God, he could do nothing. They answered and said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sin, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out of the synagogue. You know, they were well annoyed with him. And it's like, he was just saying the obvious thing. If he wasn't from God, how is it that he can heal me? You know, Jesus clearly wasn't like a sinner. It's just completely obvious. But their pride and their arrogance, because of their religion, they just couldn't let go. And we see this today, you know. It doesn't really matter what you say. It doesn't matter the testimony of peoples that you have for healing. You know, I've seen some amazing things in my life that have moved my faith from bottom to top, like just through seeing healings in people's lives. But I know that when I go and witness, if I tell people about these things, they just think I'm lying. You know, and it doesn't matter how many witnesses I have, they're not necessarily going to listen to me. So, you know, I just keep it gospel. And it's so sad, really. You know, people can cast you out because you found a love for God, and you've seen like the light, and you've seen evidence, you've seen God move in your life, and like people will cast you out anyway because they just don't want a part of this Jesus guy. And it's so like frustrating. I found myself laughing as I was reading this because I see the hypocrisy in the religious people today, in the Pharisees of the time, but also like people in the street that don't yet believe. You know, it really doesn't matter what you say or what evidence you provide them, but by and by, you know, we just do our part. In verse 35 it says, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, dost thou believe on the Son of God? Do you believe in me? Do you believe in the Son of God? You know, I am the Son of God, I'm the Son of Man, do you believe in me? And well, he just healed him of his blindness. You know, he was healed, he had blindness from birth, you know, and now he was healed. So yeah, you know, he had to believe really on the demonstration of his power, I guess. So he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. So Jesus not messing around with his words here. Jesus said, do you believe on the Son of God? And I'm speaking to you right now as the Son of God. And I know loads of people that will say, did Jesus ever say he was the Son of God? Here it is, my friends. It's right here. Jesus is saying he's the Son of God. And you know, it continues, and he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. He worshipped the Son of God. And that's because Jesus is worthy of our praise. Now, Jesus didn't say, don't worship me, you know, worship only God the Father. No, he allowed him to worship him because he's worthy of that honour, since he is the Son of God, since he is God manifested in the flesh, since he is actually divine. You know, he's worthy of our worship and our praise and adoration. And there's times in the Bible in the past when an angel has come across, you know, and people have tried to worship an angel, and the angel has said, you know, don't worship me, worship God. But Jesus isn't like that. We are allowed to worship Jesus because he's totally divine. And Jesus said, for judgment I come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. And that's the story. That's the summarization of this entire story. You know, the blind guy, his eyes were open to the gospel and to the truth, and he found God and worshipped him before him. The Pharisees, they claimed to have seen, but they were actually completely blind, and they missed God. They missed God manifested in the flesh. And the question is, I guess, you know, who are you? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you follow him as Lord? Do you worship him? Or do you have some other doctrine or some other ideas that conflict with who Jesus is? Are you a blind follower of Jesus? Or do you submit to Jesus and profess him as Lord and believe in what he says and do what he asks you to do and follow his commands? So yeah, if your eyes are open, then congratulations, you're a son or daughter of God. But if you're blind, you need to open your eyes and come to Jesus and seek and find him. He did say that if you seek and knock, you will find. So, he's there. You just need to go to him. God bless you. Thank you.